Live from the Clarity from Chaos studios, heard worldwide, it's Dave Campbell. On every episode, Dave and his guests explore, discuss, and work on solutions to some of life's biggest challenges. So, if you're ready, be prepared to be enlightened, amused, and even shocked by what you hear. And now, the real, the authentic, the one and only Dave Campbell.
Welcome back to another edition of Clarity from Chaos. I'm your host, Dave Campbell. It is hard to understand the growth of anti-Semitism in this country and why it's tolerated and even endorsed by members of our government. It's just a glaring example of just how far the socialists in this country have come from Woodrow Wilson to FDR to Obama and Biden. They have used a variety of different new techniques, however, such as CRT and utilizing woke culture to further their goals. The sad part about all of this is our very own corporate media is extremely complicit in supporting this destructive lie. To discuss this topic, we are extremely pleased to welcome back to our show the author of the new book, Debunking FDR, The Man and the Myths, Mary Grabar. Ms. Grabar is a resident fellow at the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization, and her work has been published by The Federalist, Town Hall, Front Page, Magazine, City Journal, American Greatness, and Academic Questions. Welcome to the show, Mary.
It's good to be here.
So let's start out with some of the myths that your book uncovers and start to discuss and debunking them. So if you want to kind of give everybody an overview of some of these myths, that'd be great.
Well, the myths that most people get in high school history class or social studies, as they call it nowadays, is that Franklin Roosevelt successfully steered us through the Great Depression and
okay.
And that he defeated fascism during World War II. So he's a great hero. That is the basic view. And of course, both of those, are wrong. We did defeat Nazi Germany and Japan, Imperial Japan, but there's a lot more behind that. And if we want to get into some of the more sophisticated historical analyses, that's where my book comes in.
Sure. Let's dive into it because I think everybody, looks at FDR in as much as Social Security, looking out for the little guy. And I don't think the admiration for communism, the support of socialism, and the fact that he was probably one of the ultimate racists and the father of the nanny state even gets discussed. Everybody kind of looks at him as, to your point, some kind of great hero for some of this stuff. So let's jump into some of the more sophisticated myths and shed some light on it.
One of them is that he was a traitor to his class. Now, that's something that his friend Arthur Schlesinger Jr. came up with, the historian who wrote the 3-volume series on, Roosevelt's presidency in the time period. And he said that, this awful hatred of Roosevelt at the time, which we hardly ever hear about, was actually due to the fact the rich people thought of him as a traitor to his class. That, because he was, taking care of the working man, unionizing, supporting unions, providing welfare, and taking care of the little people, they resented him and called him a traitor to his class. Now, of course, he was born into the wealthy class of the Hudson River Valley, and so they saw this as being treasonous. Well, that's not actually true at all, because he was related. He was cousin to a lot of these people, and he kept those contacts throughout his presidency and, of course, before. And they were basically dictating what he was going to do. The National Recovery Administration, which was basically collusion between the 600 biggest corporations was not for the benefit of the little guy. It was for the benefit of these crony capitalists. You know,
Right.
if you wanted to ask this guy named Jacob Magid, who was a tailor and who charged 5 cents less than the mandated price for hemming men's pants and was thrown in jail, he would tell you that Roosevelt was no traitor to his class. He was looking out for the big companies, the
Oh,
clothing
absolutely.
manufacturers.
Right.
So that is a huge myth, and it's actually the title of a book by a well-known historian by the name of H.W. Brands. So this myth has been passed on down. So that's one myth. Another myth is even by a lot of conservatives will say, well, you know, Franklin Roosevelt really didn't know much about economics. He was faced with this horrible situation when he ran for president. We were in the worst depression we've ever had. And he's just trying a lot of different things. He's got his brain trust, his advisors,
Mm-hmm.
young PhDs who are telling him what to do. And he's just desperately trying to get the country back and trying everything. And some things didn't work out, you know, the way they were supposed to, but his intentions were good. Well, as I went through his early life, you know, so I begin with his family history and his childhood. And as I started investigating his early political career, which started when he was elected state senator in New York, and then he
Right.
went on to become Assistant Secretary of the Navy, ran for vice president, served 2 terms as New York governor. Well, way back in 1912, you know, 20 years before he ran for president, when he was a state senator, he made this speech in Troy, New York, and he advocated this kind of state compulsion where we see a prefiguring of his farm policy. You know, he said, you know, I'm quoting here, many thinking people believe that the time is not far distant when the government of the state will compel every farmer to till his land or raise beef or horses. And he called that cooperation. So, you know, during the Depression, it was thought that overproduction was keeping prices down. So they were
Yeah.
compelling farmers to plow under a third of their crops and to kill piglets, you know, which they didn't even have the
Absolutely.
butchering equipment.
You
So
know,
you see this already. He's got this plan. This was his plan, was to transform this country long before Barack Obama said it.
right. And, you know, it was very much, if you look at what was going on in Russia and everything else, it was very much along the same lines of, you know, what the communists were doing. And I remember as a child, dairy farms basically dumping milk, you know, destroying milk because of the manipulation. I remember farmers laughing about being paid not to utilize so much land, but at the same time, they were using that land to graze their cattle on and everything else, but they weren't plowing it up and planting corn in it. So the whole communist kind of idea was all in wrapped around in that. And like I said in the early piece, I think he was also very much the father of the nanny state, as you know, as he took his presidency forward.
Oh, absolutely. He, you know, he wanted big government power. He was an admirer of Joseph Stalin. And, you know, I joke and say that, you know, there was a one-way bromance between the two. Franklin
Right.
Roosevelt wanted to gain his favor. He was like a suitor who, you know, was being rejected constantly and manipulated by the one, you know, he was courting. So, yes, you know, in his heart, he was a, you know, someone who wanted, you know, to govern from the commanding heights, which is to
Right.
use Lenin's phrase.
Well, the other piece is, and I found it interesting, is he's very much like Joe Biden in as much as his contract manipulation when he was not Secretary of the Navy, but he was Deputy Secretary, right?
He was assistant secretary.
Assistant Secretary. Yeah, he was a corrupt little booger, and never was really held account for it. Very much like, you know, like the Bidens have never, probably never will be held account for their manipulations of things.
Yeah, he overruled Josephus Daniels, his superior, his boss. That was the only time he really had a job where he had a boss, and went behind his back, started and finished building projects before the contract was even signed. He, with Lewis Howe, his sidekick, bought explosives from Chile, which was illegal. They brought them over. And he was constantly maneuvering and manipulating to undermine, his boss. And like his fifth cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he took advantage when his boss went out, say just for an afternoon or a meeting. And, he was technically in authority there, and did whatever he could, to assert his authority and take credit for things that other people had done and inflate his record. As a matter of fact, I found this quite interesting. He went to Groton, the prep school in Massachusetts, and, then of course went on to Harvard, which is, where the vast majority
we're going to talk about Harvard in a little bit.
Yeah. So he served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I. Now, his cousin, of course, had, quit suddenly his position and went off, to...
He joined. Yeah.
Right, and he led the Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War, right?
Yep.
And, gained quite a reputation for that. Well, Franklin Roosevelt didn't do anything like that. He sort of bragged about, how he, went over on a destroyer. He took a tour of Europe. He took a tour of the battlefields in the, last days of the war, was protected by the military. And then just about as the war was ending, he asked for a commission to the Bureau of Navigation. And of course, by that time, Wilson told him, well, the war is just about over. But there were 18 graduates of Groton who lost their lives in World War I. And there was a memorial there for them, I think some kind of plaque or monument. And Franklin Roosevelt thought that he should be included with them and honored for his service as Assistant Secretary of the Navy.
Yeah.
I mean, this is how egotistical he was.
Oh, absolutely. And it kind of struck me of kind of a Blumenthal kind of moment where, I was in the jungles of Vietnam and so on and so forth. And, that was all debunked. Or lately Tim Walsh, in his miraculous service, to the country. It was the same kind of misleading the public in lieu of trying to build up your name.
Yeah, and when he went and gave his speech, his acceptance speech in 1932, and he did something. He broke tradition by flying to Chicago, and it was kind of choppy weather, and he was a little late, and he goes up to the microphone and says, yes, it was a good thing. The weather was kind of bad, but it was a good thing I had my Navy training. And it's like, what Navy training? You were Assistant Secretary of the Navy. His major accomplishments were to design a flag. Secretary of the Navy already had a flag. And so he designed one for himself as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. The Secretary of the Navy also had a 17-gun salute when he, went on board ships. And Franklin Roosevelt implemented that for himself as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Right. He just loved the pageantry, being the center of attention.
Right. Well, I know he wanted to get into the war badly. And I've read several books that kind of allude to our Pearl Harbor, if you will, that FDR kind of staged that whole event to get us sucked into the war. And I was wondering if in your research you came up with anything that kind of pointed in that direction or not, because everything I've read that you wrote kind of leads me to believe that would not be beyond FDR to do something like that. I mean, to throw 3,000 plus people away to get yourself some kind of stance in a world war wouldn't seem out of character.
Absolutely. He had no qualms about that. He actually was going to send someone on a suicide mission because he thought the attack would come near the Philippines, and it didn't. But he was given warning by Admiral Richardson a year before Pearl Harbor and said, this fleet is very vulnerable to attack. Roosevelt didn't really dispute him. What he said was, well, I can't do that now. It's an election year.
Right.
So
Yeah.
his reelection was more important to him than the lives of thousands of servicemen
Oh,
or
absolutely.
whoever else may be killed.
Yeah.
This is who he was. I mean, he was, a politician, a Simon Pure politician, as someone once called him. And so, and of course, did he want, Pearl Harbor to be attacked? Well, he wanted to provoke something to get us
Yeah.
into the war, and he tried his
Yeah. Yeah. He poked them in the eye on several occasions. One of them was cutting off their uh, their supply line out of China, and he used some kind of a dreamed up thing about they were in China, and they were doing bad deeds, so therefore he was going to blockade that. But the Japanese basically told him, you stop our ability to power our country, there's going to be an issue. And I found it remarkable, Mary, that even in the last movie, the current movie of Midway, at the very beginning of that movie, Japanese command basically told us, don't do this or there's going to be a problem. And 6 months later, December 7th, right? So,
Mhm.
like I said, I've read several books on it, but it's kind of like putting the tinfoil hat on. You just don't know. But given the persona that you present in the book, to me, it's not a stretch to believe that he would do something like that. Just like it's not a stretch to believe some of the things about John F. K. or Bobby, the assassination of King. Any of that stuff, because we've seen it in real time with Trump, right? We've seen all of that stuff that they've manipulated and lied about just right to our faces, expecting us to swallow it. So the one thing that did strike me, though, was, and I saw some stuff today, and that was the level of his racism. If it wasn't for his wife, basically, the Carnegie pilots and black soldiers probably wouldn't have seen a lot of presence in the Second World War. I mean, they would have been relegated to being cooks and janitors and such, right?
Yeah, he, there was a whole exhibit at the Roosevelt Museum on race, and they, admit a little bit that, he wasn't really progressive on issues of race, but usually, as they do with liberals, they attribute it to, the times, and, which
Yeah,
they, of
yeah.
course, won't do for conservatives. But there's another project I've been working on, a biography of George Schuyler, a conservative Black uh, writer with the Pittsburgh Courier. He lived from 1895 to 1977. And, he came to hate Roosevelt, and he began as a socialist and became a very strong anti-communist and conservative. And it was due to Roosevelt. So he got a taste of what collectivism is like. Now, in 1938, his newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, put together this military equality bill, and it would
Uh-huh.
not, have made things completely equal, but it would have, assigned Black
Right.
sailors and soldiers to more, uh, appropriate positions as,
Right.
as fighting men rather than as cooks and as,
Right.
valets and so forth. And the bill was then introduced into Congress by Hamilton Fish, who represented Dutchess County. And he was a big enemy of FDR. FDR absolutely hated him. It's probably because FDR couldn't win the votes in his own county, and Hamilton Fish did, and Hamilton Fish was much more popular. But that bill went nowhere. Roosevelt wasn't going to do anything. And even when he had the political capital to do it at his most popular time, he wouldn't lift a finger to really help blacks or other minorities or workers.
Well, I know Eleanor, she did the Tuskegee fly around and stuff like that and supported the airmen there. And what got into today was George Patton. There was an all-black tank battalion.
Yes.
Said the 7-6, and Patton is on record saying, I don't care what color you are as long as you kill Germans. And the interesting thing was, in that black battalion, all of the officers were white because they didn't trust black infantrymen, or not infantrymen, tankmen, for doing the right thing. So I thought that was, kind of compelling, because that's the kind of stuff you don't hear about, but it directly relates to who our commander-in-chief was at that time.
Yeah, and Hamilton Fish served in World War I, and he led the Harlem Hellcats. And, George Schuyler praised, Hamilton Fish, because while the other white commanders, would blame the black soldiers for anything that went wrong, Hamilton Fish defended them, and they were stationed in the South.
Right.
And there was a threat of a riot. These white soldiers were going to attack. And he told the commanding officer, this was like someplace in Mississippi or Alabama, he told the commanding officer of the white troops, he said, if they start threatening my men, I will give them permission to pick up arms, and you don't want to let them do that. He stood up for them, and he was a Republican from Dutchess County, and Roosevelt absolutely despised him. As a matter of fact, he was instrumental in helping to, redistrict, his area, and eventually, because of that, Hamilton Fish, no longer served. But there you go. These are little known stories that I think gold, because Franklin Roosevelt has this reputation as friend of blacks. Now, this weekend, down in Warm Springs in Georgia, where he had the little White House and the spa for polio victims, and it's now a museum, but they had a celebration. I think it's the 80th anniversary of his death there. It was April 12th, and they had Raphael Warnock there. It's
oh my
I've lived
God.
in Georgia for 30 years, and I can't believe that he's a senator from Georgia.
Well, I can't either.
And he's like, praising Franklin Roosevelt. He did so many things for black people. I mean, he was one of the biggest racists. Also anti-Semitic, anti-Irish. Yeah. Anti-German. Absolutely hated Germans. Hated the Japanese.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, he put the Japanese in internment camps.
And Germans as well.
Yeah, and the Germans as well. And, very little, that's all kind of gotten shoveled under the dustbins and thrown past into history, that we took an entire race of individuals, U.S. citizens, and put them in concentration camp. No, they put them in camps. When I was in the service, we used to call it Jap Mesa, which is down by Pendleton. Mm. They don't call it Jap Mesa anymore because that's politically incorrect. But that's where they had all the camps, right, for the Japanese.
Yeah, and there were a lot of wartime atrocities, and I don't like to call them concentration camps, because that really belittles the experiences of what real concentration camps.
Yeah, precisely that. Yeah, exactly.
Went through. It's just gotten that connotation.
Right.
And
they did lock them up, though, right? They did gather them up and put them in one spot, right? So.
Oh yeah, it definitely was an injustice. I'm not going to disagree with that, but there were injustices done to a lot of people during the war.
Yeah, but the reason I bring it up is to juxtapose that with what Trump is trying to do to get the illegals out of this country when you had the gathering of all of these people and putting them in one spot, and now you have these morons fighting Trump, who's just trying to get people that's not even supposed to be here out of here. I just found that just a little bit, just a little bit strange.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's, I remember in 2006 when illegals were protesting. I'm an immigrant. I mean, I came to this country when I was 2 years old. And, growing up, I can't imagine my parents or my friends' parents protesting in the streets. No, you're
Oh yeah,
grateful for what you have. You take any job that they'll give you. You pick up the broom or the mop, or you
yeah,
sit at the
exactly.
machine in the factory. You don't go out there protesting and expecting welfare and everything. I mean, it's
No.
outrageous, especially to me.
Yeah, well, I think to most, I hate to use the word normal, Mary, but to most people, that's what you do, right? You go to this new country where there's this opportunity, and wherever you start at, that's where you start at, and it's you work to move up, right? And that's what it's all about, the work and everything else. And it's not about victimhood or anything else, because you're so glad that you're in a country where you can do that, right? So,
Yeah, it's like my late father used to say the first two things he learned how to say in English was okay, because when the boss, he was a welder, and when the
right?
boss pointed to something, he would say okay and thank you.
Yeah, yeah. So let's shift gears. I want to get into this anti-Semitism because, obviously, all the Ivy League schools have been thumbing their nose at everybody, and you have all of this anti-Semitism. And I don't know where and how this has come about, Mary. And I was wondering if you had some thoughts around it, because you've got members of Congress that, as far as I'm concerned, based on things that they've said, should be stripped of their congressional role and handed a plane ticket to go back to Somalia or wherever they're from. And, they use the guise of the First Amendment to protect themselves from being morons, but they're still morons.
Well, I think, as far as the college campuses go, which is where all this is really emanating from, the anti-Semitism is part of a broader anti-Western hatred. And when I was in graduate
Right,
school back in the 90s, I saw this. Everything about the West was bad, according to my professors and according to people writing academic articles, and you had to resist it. So Israel is just being put into this, broad category of an imperialist, colonialist nation that subjugates the other. So it's hated
right.
because it's Western and it's an ally. And so, the morons, as you call them, don't seem to understand that, because someone does not make them guilty of imperialism or genocide as they
No,
claim, but they are so indoctrinated with this ideology that I think they can't see it. And I mean, I never thought that I would, live to see what's going on, the open anti-Semitism,
well, to me, and I know this is a stretch, but that would be the same to me as being angry at Catholics because of the Inquisition.
Well, they still are.
It's just, it's that same kind of silly stretch, right? I don't know how they get there from here, but my point, I guess, is, and Trump's trying to deal with this with Harvard. Number one, I don't know why any of these schools are getting government subsidies anyway. I don't understand that, because me paying for them to teach this kind of crap, I want my money back, right? And I think a lot of taxpayers are going, well, wait a minute, I'm paying for these professors to teach hatred to the very ground that I'm walking on. That seems kind of foolish.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, whatever the logic was of subsidizing these schools that have these huge endowments, they get
Right.
so much private money, other than some maybe legitimate research contracts, right, where they're doing things for the military or in medicine, right, with strict oversight. I don't see why we should be subsidizing them at all, or why the government should be involved in, uh, you know, that, I mean, of course, Barack Obama was the one who put the student loan programs under, the federal government. They were private
Right.
before. And that, that's part of his plan. He
Right.
is seen as the second coming of FDR. He was
Right.
presented that way. Well,
Yeah. Yeah.
when he was,
Yeah.
campaigning and when he
And
was
in all
elected.
honesty, he probably lived up to it, Mary. I mean,
Well, yeah,
because, Obama was probably as racist as FDR was, probably still is, actually. I know Michelle, the stuff from Michelle Obama basically has a racial tint to it. Pinning him as the FDR coming of FDR is probably not too far off the mark.
Well, yeah, I mean, he wanted to transform, the country, and
Right.
he got a good head start with FDR. FDR put things in place. He put in place Social Security. He
Right.
said, we'll never, once I put these taxes in place, we'll never get rid of the damn thing.
Right.
And same thing with unemployment insurance, banking insurance, all these programs that, we're sort of, it's sort of a codependent relationship, so banking insurance, okay, well, your savings are insured, but taxpayers are paying for that. And
Yeah.
they're paying for the bailouts of the big banks,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. Yeah,
Right.
I
And
mean, yeah,
thank
the whole thing with the middle class basically was put in place as a risk mitigation, if you will, to corporations and everything else, banks and everybody else, because that's where the bailouts came from, right? They came out of my wallet, your wallet, and everybody else's wallet. So, I mean, how could they fail, right? How can you fail if you know you've got 300 million people that are going to back you up? It's kind of discouraging when you get to think about it. And so my last question would be, do you think Trump is going to be successful to a certain extent in reducing this government monster?
Well, I hope so. It's a huge task, and I know the mentality of the people who work in government and in education. I was around them for 20 years. I've gone to their conferences, and that they firmly believe that they are the salvation of this country and that they are owed their money and their power, and they will do everything, every kind of subterfuge,
Right.
just in education, which is, what I pay attention to particularly. They're renaming programs,
Right.
keeping the same people, renaming things.
Yeah.
And, and that's what I was trying to do when I was still teaching, was to alert the public and say, look, this is how these people operate.
Yeah,
They
I think
like
the new term is belonging or something like that, right?
yes.
Yeah. So Trump's going to have to write an executive order outlawing belonging. Something, but you're absolutely right. They're wordsmithing their way around everything.
Yeah, I'd be happy to advise them if you if you wanted. I can fill him in on the tricks.
Yep, there you go. Where can people find your book?
Any place fine books are sold. It's published by Regnery. You can go to Amazon, Barnes and Noble, independent bookstores, order it through them.
Right.
They tend to be very liberal, and tell them you want a conservative book.
Can
And
people get it off your website?
yes, you can go to marygrabar.com and also sign up for my newsletter.
Oh, okay. Great. We've been talking to Mary Grabar, who's the author of a great book called Debunking FDR, The Man and the Myths. And it's well worth the read. And I think you'll find that, the curtain for the wizard has been pulled back. And you see exactly what the wizard looks like. And you can identify him in various forms, not only in FDR, but in people that have taken his job, going forward as well. So it's been an absolute pleasure, Mary, as always, and I look forward to having you back on.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure for me too. Thanks.
Have a great Easter weekend and celebrate accordingly, right?
I will.
All right,
Definitely.
take care.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening. If you would like to listen to more Clarity from Chaos shows on demand, go to clarityfromchaos.buzzsprout.com or send Dave an email at info@clarityfromchaos.com for information on previous shows. You can also listen to the show on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Twitter, or Google Podcast. Until next time, please remember, it's not about waiting for the storm to pass. It's about learning to dance in the rain. Be well, everyone.